Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a special episode of the Drachmas and Denarii podcast. As always, I'm your host, Sam. Today I've got a very fun walkthrough video for you guys. So I just flew back in yesterday from Istanbul, where I spent about 3 days touring the city, looking at all the Byzantine sites. And so I thought it would be fun to put together kind of an ultimate trip to Byzantine Constantinople and to let you guys know all of the different sites you might want to go investigate when you're there. And accompanying this video, I've actually got a Google Maps list of every single Byzantine site in the city that you might want to go see. This includes lots of Byzantine churches, old ruins, palaces, museums, etc., etc. So I've got about a total of 47 different places. And if you check it out here in the description of each item, so you might see here like the name of a mosque that may not stand out of what the Byzantine relevance is, but then I've got a short historical summary of why this area is important. For example, this one was originally actually the monastery of Lips. I kind of explain the Byzantine significance and then also include a link to a web page that describes all this. Yeah, pretty crucial and fundamental for the planning of my trip to Istanbul was actually the use of this website, the ByzantineLegacy.com. Whoever has put this together has done a very good job of more or less gathering almost every site they have in Istanbul from Byzantine history. They've got it laid out by churches, palaces, columns and monuments, the hippodrome, fortifications, aqueduct and cisterns, and Galatia. But one downside is, from what they've done here, they've got a wonderful Google map, but you actually can't use this from the website. You're not able to download it or import it into your own Google Maps. And likewise, you're actually not able to see your own location on this map. So it's pretty difficult to navigate, especially when you're trying to find some ruins to actually see where this really is on the ground. So what I've done is actually plot a lot of the sites mentioned on this website, as well as ones that aren't mentioned on the website. And this way, in Google Maps with this shared list, you can add that to your own map and then actually navigate this and then see, like I said, all the sites on the map, including a description and a link to the information about the historical significance of that site. So yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and run through my sort of 3 days in Istanbul, really 2 days. I think what I'm about to show you, everything I've seen, you can manage that in about 2 days. So I'm going to walk right through. So this is the picture from the plane, kind of flying into Istanbul, the airport, which is a lot of fun. We had a taxi cab pick us up. That was actually pretty nice, sort of a limousine. So we were showing up to the city of Constantine and Byzantium in style. Yeah, exactly. So kind of pulling up to the city. This was from the taxi cab. You can kind of get a good feel for the city, sort of just the excitement of actually pulling up to this, in my opinion, hallowed ground where so many emperors and empresses have walked and so much history has been undertaken. You can see also some of the churches and mosques pulling up here. And then even just on the taxi ride to our apartment, you could see lots of different historical sites. This is the Aqueduct of Valens, for example. I'll have more pictures and an explanation later on in the video, but just some of the very famous and iconic scenes you just see even from the car ride up there. More pictures of Istanbul here. And then we've also got here another example. This is the palace of the Bukelion. I am probably mispronouncing, but if you look here, I've actually included this on the website. So for example, this is the area. It's closed right now for renovations, but another example of something you could see from the car. But yeah, so kind of getting to the apartment, I'll go and skip some of these videos of our room. I'm sure that's not too interesting, but kind of walking up from where we were about 10 minutes from the Hagia Sophia, so a super ideal location. You kind of already get to see a flavor of the city with the minaret here and colorful cafes. And so this is actually walking up onto the Hippodrome in Constantinople. So what you see here, it's a little bit of a poor photo, but it's actually the masonry obelisk. But I'm going to go through all these sites here in a little bit more depth in just a moment. This is just kind of to show you my initial experience that when you show up to the city, you actually kind of walk up from at least our Airbnb the side, right onto the old Hippodrome, which is very exciting, with lots of interesting monuments and artifacts. And so, kind of very exciting was the walk up at first to Hagia Sophia, and then just seeing the mass impact this has on the skyline. It's quite overwhelming just in terms of the size, the breadth and depth of this building. It really is something to behold. And later on in the video, I'll be showing again more close up to the church and also my experience inside. This was kind of just first getting into the city, walking up and getting to see this magnificent church with so much history. It really is beautiful. And so, kind of one of the first things I did was actually walk to the Bosphorus and go sit down in the rocks for a while, just kind of looking at the water, getting a feel for the area, for the geography, and also a good way to unwind after a flight to take in some of the ocean, the fresh air there. It really is a beautiful part of the city. And so here we see even just going to the sea there at the Bosphorus, walking up, we're already seeing some of the sea walls from the city. So the Byzantine sites are all over, kind of sprinkled through. And the first site I'm going to take a serious look at here is actually walking up from the Bosphorus towards the old Hippodrome site. So we can kind of see on this map here where my mouse is circling was about where I was, and I kind of walked up the city along here, coming to the west side of the Hippodrome. And if we look here, we can kind of see a hypothetical rendering of the city of what it might have looked like. And what I'm about to show you are the photos of the Sphinodrome, excuse me. So that is actually in the Hippodrome. You have two different ends. The first end is a straight end with the gates. If we look here, this is actually where the horses would be released, the chariots, and where they would race around. And then the second end, which is the curved part, that's where the audience would sit. And the retaining wall has actually survived from this. So we get a good idea of the scale of the Hippodrome. And you can see that I've also included that location on my map. If we look here at the city, you can get an idea for the width and breadth of the Hippodrome, because even though you see right up here these three little locations, you have the obelisk of Theodosius, the serpent column, and then the masonry obelisk. But the Sphinodome is actually quite a good distance away, and so this kind of indicates where the Hippodrome would have actually extended. So really, you pretty much have the Hippodrome from where my mouse is, going all the way up to the Palace of Antiochus around there up top. So the ancient area would have been quite a bit larger than what you kind of see today laid out by the city of Istanbul. But yeah, so kind of walking up to that area, if I could go drive below here, you see the Sphinodome wall. Like I said, that's the retaining wall in one of the ends of the Hippodrome here, which is very interesting just to kind of get that initial footprint here. And the idea there was that where the Hippodrome was laid out, obviously in antiquity, you would have wanted to have a flat racing track. It wouldn't do any good to have an uneven surface, but the topography of the city of Istanbul, of Constantinople, it's actually very uneven and very hilly. So this was built to pretty much level out the racing track and to make sure that nothing was uneven. It's also part of the reason it survived, because other buildings were built on top of the retaining wall. So the upper portion of the Hippodrome is gone, but the Sphinodome is still there. And so, like I said, that's on the map here. You can kind of see where in the city that would be. And so we're walking from the Bosphorus up to the Sphinodome and then now towards the Hippodrome. And so first in Hippodrome, of what we see is actually the masonry obelisk. And so this is a very interesting artifact here. We're not entirely sure when it was built. It appears that it was built in late antiquity at some point to ape a similar obelisk at the Roman Hippodrome, to give the city of Constantinople a parallel feel to mirror that original one in Rome. And so we don't actually know exactly when it was built. Kind of interesting is from a lot of obelisks that we know, obviously it's going to be cut from one piece of stone, but here we can see it's actually many different bricks that are put together. And the reason for that is actually because it was initially covered with a bronze sheet. So you wouldn't have actually seen these individual bricks, but there would have been a bronze coating on top of it. But during the Fourth Crusade, the Crusaders actually stripped that off and melted it down. So what's left behind then is the bricks underneath. But for most of the period that we're interested in, for Byzantium and late Rome, it would have actually appeared to be a bronze obelisk. And anyway, the state we see it in now was actually restored by Constantine VII, a famous Roman emperor, a Byzantine emperor. So the inscription we see here actually commemorates that. And the inscription translated from the Greek reads, "The four-sided marvel of the uplifted, wasted by time, now Constantine the Emperor," and that's Constantine VII, "now Constantine the Emperor, whose son is Romanus, The glory of the kingship restores better than the ancient spectacle, for the Colossus was a wonder once in Rhodes, and now this is a brazen wonder here. So as we can see, the emperor takes pride in restoring this monument to his city, and of course the Byzantines are very proud of their Greek and Roman heritage. There's a reference made in allusion to the Colossus of Rhodes. And funnily enough, this is actually pretty much about the exact same height as that. So even though we don't have perhaps the same artistry in the sense of that being a magnificent statue, the Colossus of Rhodes, the bronze coating at the time likely would have had decorations anyway. And so we should remember that what we're seeing here is actually sort of a burnt out whole of what was originally there that's been lost thanks to the Fourth Crusade. And so next up after that is the Serpent's Column, and then just to make clear where we are, this is actually a map of this specific area. And so I mentioned here the Sphinodome, what we saw, that's kind of here in the lower west corner, and then in the Hippodrome you actually have three remaining artifacts. The bronze obelisk, which obviously is bronze no more, the Delphi tripod, which we're about to get to, and the Egyptian obelisk. But in terms of this, so the serpent column, what this is called here, this is actually a very interesting artifact. It actually goes back and has a very, very deep and rich history. It was minted by the ancient Greeks to commemorate their victory at the Battle of Plataea. Plataea, I'm not sure how you exactly pronounce that, but that was the victory over the more or less final Persian incursion into ancient Greece, which is very interesting. That would have been against the Persian general Mardonius, and the united forces of the Greeks actually won. And they decided to, from the spoils of war, actually melt down the weaponry of the defeated and vanquished Persians and cast this. So it would have been a snake artifact with three heads, as we can see here, and there would have originally actually been a golden bowl on top of this bronze area to commemorate that as a tripod. And so what has survived is actually just the column piece. But what's interesting is, of course, this has a history dating back to the ancient Greeks who defeated the Persians. Not only that, though, it's got a very impressive provenance too, in the sense that it was actually written about in Herodotus in his histories. And now quoting from Herodotus, he says, having brought all the loot together, they, being the Greeks, set apart a tithe for the god of Delphi. From this was made and dedicated that tripod which rests upon the bronze three-headed serpent nearest to the altar. So we actually had this written about in Herodotus, and we know that the Greeks put it at Delphi. And again, Pausanias, the famous sort of tourist guide of ancient Greece, he also remarks about this and writes more history about the artifact, kind of writing about what it's been through and what it's seen. So it's very interesting that this has still survived. And then, like I said, the Greeks dedicated this at the Apollo temple in Delphi. And then Constantine, when he built the city of Constantinople, actually removed this piece, like many other artworks, to the city to add an element of grandeur to his new project. And the inscription from the ancient Greeks reads, on the 13th coil from the bottom, those who fought the war. And then coils 12 through 13 name the 31 city-states and the number of men who fought. So you have the Lacedaemonians, aka the Spartans, with 10,000 men, the Athenians with 8,000, Corinthians with 5,000, Tegeans with 1,500, and it goes on and on to list everyone that actually fought in this battle to defeat the ancient Persians. But it's a super interesting monument, and to see this much history in the area dating back to ancient Greece makes you wonder of just the wonders of antiquity and how some of this has survived. And more sadly, actually, the previous episode we went over the sale I'm going to have about Byzantine coins, but I actually did a very nice write-up here about the events of the Fourth Crusade. And the reason that this piece actually survived, it was believed by the locals, the local Byzantines, to be a talisman, and that this column, which was turned into a fountain, actually warded off snakes, poisonous snakes from the city. So it's believed the only reason the Fourth Crusaders didn't melt this piece down and that it would have been lost forever is because it was believed to protect the city from snakes. And so here we're going to read a passage from Nikitas Choniates, who writes about the events happening here. So let me just read a little bit about this. I think that sets the tone and the mood. That the events of the Fourth Crusade, let me go back to the artifact here for you all just to see this. But the events of the Fourth Crusade and the subsequent Latin Empire based around Constantinople cast a long shadow for a flame that burned but briefly. Much that took place in and around the momentous year of 1204 is a canvas on which the coinage to follow was illuminated. For the Philhellene and the lover of antiquity, perhaps the most saddening crime committed by the invading Western forces was the wholesale destruction of ancient Greek statuary to mint coinage. Let us quote Nicetas Choniates, the great chronicler of such wanton events. And here are the words of Nicetas: because they, the Crusaders, were in want of money, for the barbarians are unable to sate their love of riches, they covetously eyed the bronze statues and consigned these to flames. The brazen Hera, standing in the form of Constantine, was cast into a smelting furnace and minted into coins. Her head could barely be carted off to the great palace by 4 yokes of oxen. Paris Alexander, standing with Aphrodite and handing to her the golden apple of discord, was thrown down from his pedestal and cast on top of Hera, who, having laid his eyes on the four-sided bronze mechanical device, rising up to a height nearly equal that of the tallest columns, which have been set up in many places throughout the city, did not wonder at the intricacy of its ornamentation. Every melodious bird, warbling in springtime tunes, was carved upon it. The tasks of husbandmen, the pipes and milk pails, and the bleating sheep and bounding lambs were depicted. The widespread sea and schools of fish were to be seen, some caught and others shown breaking out of the nets that swim free again in the deep. And Nicetas goes on and on, mentioning all the beautiful statues that were melted down by the Crusaders. And then he continues, nonetheless, they gave over this most beautiful work to the smelters. These barbarians, haters of the beautiful, did not allow the statues standing in the hippodrome and other marvelous works of art to escape destruction, but all were made into coins. Uh, and finally, he ends with, thus great things were exchanged for small ones. Those works fashioned at huge expenses were converted into worthless copper coins. And that's the fate of many thousands of pieces of artwork, hundreds perhaps, that were in the city that were all lost thanks to that sack and subsequent events with the Ottomans. And so you can imagine just the awe around a piece like this that dates back to the ancient Greeks. It's mentioned in Herodotus. It ties back to the Persian War, perhaps the most influential war in the history of Western civilization, and that would have been destroyed to mint coins that look like this. So it's a very great travesty, but also kind of interesting in that some of these coins are actually minted from the finest statues of antiquity. But like I said, this one was spared just because it was thought to be a fountain that would ward off snakes, and so it was left alone, but the rest of the statues were destroyed. You can imagine then what the Hippodrome might have looked like back in the day, full of statues like this, full of the greatest artwork. Um, yeah, very sad. And the next item here that we're going to look at is the obelisk of Theodosius. So this is a very interesting piece sorry, give me one sec to find my notes here. This is made from Aswan granite, and it actually dates back to the 15th century BC, where it was commissioned by the Egyptian pharaoh Thutmose III to commemorate his victories in Syria. So the upper part here, we have an obelisk that dates back to about the 15th century BC, and the lower part, the pedestal on which it's based, was made by the Emperor Theodosius I. And so this was actually made to commemorate his victory over the usurper Magnus Maximus and by his son Victor. And so we actually see here the emperor in the Kathisma, and the Kathisma is actually the imperial box for viewing the games at the Hippodrome. And you've got to imagine too, in ancient Constantinople, like in ancient Rome actually too, the Hippodrome was a focal point of where the people would actually come, meet, and interact with the emperor. Even though ancient Rome also had the Colosseum, the Hippodrome in ancient Rome was much larger, and we know from the ancient sources that the Hippodrome in Rome was a much more volatile place, where the people usually came into contact with the emperor, not always peaceful, and made their demands known upon him. And so we have a similar dynamic playing out in Constantinople now, to where the Hippodrome is sort of the focal point of where the common people meet the emperor. And so that's why a lot of this art was sort of displayed here to give the emperor some legitimacy. But it should be remembered that this is almost the pure focal point of the city, if not religiously, then at least secularly for the period. And so it's kind of fun to see a depiction here of the emperor sitting in his box, as he would have done throughout many centuries watching the games. So you see that below the panel we just looked at, there are scenes of various charioteers going around here at the Hippodrome during the games. So we kind of get an idea of the action going on, the different scenes you might expect. And going around, we see different panels as well as inscriptions here. And so we can read the inscriptions here. The Greek inscription translates to only the Emperor Theodosius, daring to upraise the four-sided pillar, ever lying a burden on the earth, called Proculus to his aid, and so a huge pillar stood up in 32 days. And so that gives us obviously a timeline about this, how long it took to make, and it's very interesting to have that connection and to even understand the timelines of the construction of such a piece. And I mean, it's such a guide that I'm doing now. I can't give all the history. That's why I've included those links to the website I mentioned. But the symbolism here of the four sides also depicts the four seasons, and you have a lot of lunar and solar references throughout these depictions here that connect the obelisk not only to the emperor himself and his placement in the hippodrome, but also celestial connections to the role of the emperor and mankind within the sort of grand scheme of fate, you might say. So it's a very interesting piece that I think is definitely worth a further investigation. And then here on this side, we can actually see scenes of this obelisk getting put up in the hippodrome. So yeah, a very interesting piece here. And the Latin side here translated reads, difficult once I was ordered to be obedient to the serene masters, and after the tyrants had been extinguished, to carry the palm. All things cede to Theodosius in his undying issue. Thus I, defeated and tamed in 30 days, when Proculus was judge, was raised to the skies above. And so this speaks of the perspective of the monument, actually, and then Theodosius' great victory over the usurpers. And of course, I'm sure as we all know, with that, he's the last emperor to actually rule over the joint empire, East and West united. Perhaps you can make a case for Justinian, but in the sense of the intact Roman Empire with one man at the head, he is the last individual to do that, and this monument actually commemorates that. And of course, Istanbul is very well known for the street cats, so this is probably one of many photos we're going to see of just cute little cats and kittens all over the city, wanting some attention and also some food. And so here we're coming back on Hagia Sophia a little bit later in the day. So I kind of mentioned earlier that this guide is meant for a 2-day trip. This is more or less 2.5. So this is the evening of Friday, but we're going to go visit all these sites again Saturday. So it's very doable to see everything I'm going to lay out here in 2 days. But anyway, this is looking now at the Milion once we come close. And the Milion was actually the mile marker in Constantinople. This was built by Constantine. It's a very interesting piece because from here, this actually is the measurement from all distances in the empire. Oops, I apologize, I just clicked out. But the Milion actually, it is the mile marker that depicts the distances from which everything else in the empire is measured. So it's very interesting to see just because you can imagine that that's pretty much from a geographical sense the heart of the empire. And although what you're going to see here, I'm almost back at that picture, what you're going to see here is just a singular column piece. It was actually initially a large arch, but most of that actually hasn't survived, and they found this one fragment of it and erected it as a pillar, but the original form would have looked much different. And there are many statues around here from Constantine and his family, and then also later on Justinian added some uh, buildings around some further art and statues. And this is also very important. Not only is it the distance point of which everything else is measured, but also during the imperial coronations and the ceremonies around that. This is where the emperors were hailed by the different factions, the blues and the greens, during imperial processions. So it's there's a lot of history here, and of course, with a spot like this, you can probably go on for a couple hours just discussing what events have happened here and what this has seen. So I definitely recommend that you check out the links that will be attached below. But it's very cool to see this, that this is the geographical heart of the empire. And so again, Hagia Sophia, just kind of some more photos. But like I said, we're going to go into that church a little bit later. Now this is the column of Constantine. And so this actually marks the spot where he builds his forum. And it's a porphyry column. I know it's night now, so you can't see the quality too well, but it's the famous purple imperial stone. And this was marked or marking the spot of his forum, which is very well known and along the main Byzantine road. So if we go back here, we can see on this depiction, a reconstruction, on the far left here, you see this large open circular area with a column that actually is the exact same column. So you can kind of here get an idea from the distance between where the hippodrome was and where the column is. And then you can also see along this area then, that would be about where the Nelion arch would have been to mark the distances of the empire. But yeah, it's a very important spot. We can see here um, the hippodrome along the main road. It ends at the church of Hagia Sophia, but the Forum of Constantine is the last stop, more or less, until you reach the church of Saint Sophia, of Hagia Sophia. So this was a very important site for commercial activity, for business, attached to the ancient harbors as well. So very cool to see this now. It's in the middle of a bustling part of the city, lots of shops around, but certainly fun to see. And although there was originally a statue on the top that's long since been lost, and the rings you see around the pillar were actually added during Ottoman times to prevent the column from collapsing and breaking. So that actually holds the structure in place. And of course, here you can also see people in the background just to get an idea of the scale, the immensity of this. And here we see Hagia Sophia, um, and then also some Islamic light decorations between two minarets. It used to be a museum, but some of Erdogan's new policies have seen Byzantine churches that were made secular during Ataturk's reign and after being reconverted into mosques. But we'll talk about that also a little bit later. Kind of more of the city, Hagia Sophia again at night. One of the street dogs here, and then a meal I had, a very interesting Turkish dish with some lamb and onions, different ingredients. That was also very good. And so this was pretty much the start of our full day one. What you saw yesterday was just kind of a half day to sort of get acclimated in the city, just to get the vibes, to understand the culture, and kind of maybe get a sense of the scale, the distance, and all those sorts of things. But this is kind of day one of the main sightseeing. And so we started this out actually at the Airbnb host we were staying at in his apartment. He invited us up to breakfast for some Turkish tea, and Memanon, I think, was the name of the breakfast. I have to check that out, research that to make sure I said that right. But it's a very interesting location here. You can't see it from my angle, but you actually have views over the whole Bosphorus. So that was a nice way to start out our day. And our first step here on day one was to go to, of course, Hagia Sophia. When you're in the city, I think that must be the first place you want to go to. It's the most renowned, and very close to where we were staying anyway. So that was our first stop, as you can see here on the map. We were pretty lucky too. The queue was actually not long at all, so we went just around opening time. Later in the day, we walked by, and I would guess the queue was perhaps 2 or 3 hours. So I think that if you're going to the city, it makes a lot of sense to actually just knock this out in the beginning and get there a little bit before 9 a.m. to make sure you can go without huge crowds. I mean, it was obviously still very busy, but compared to how it was later, I think we got quite lucky. And so this is actually the walk-up. As I mentioned earlier, with Erdogan and Turkish policy, the many churches and museums were converted into mosques now since 2020, and Hagia Sophia is no exception. So the ground floor is actually closed off. The old ceremonial entrance that would have been used for the museum times is no longer open to the public, only towards Turkish Muslims. So you actually enter through a side ramp that gets you up to the upper galleries, and the bottom floor is closed off. But here we can see the general impressions of when you first walk into the Hagia Sophia from the upper floors. You can see some of the side areas here, and then sort of opening up into the famous Grand Dome. You can also see straight ahead, dead ahead, some of the famous mosaics still intact. That is a seraphim, and I suppose it does not offend Islamic sensibilities, otherwise it would have been covered up or destroyed. But that's still there, left open during the worship space. And so here we can kind of see the main dome of Hagia Sophia. The chandelier kind of blocks the light, so the scale is a bit hard to see, but I'll have some videos later. But it really is truly impressive. I've never been in any building quite like this, and I've lived all over in London, traveled across the States and Europe, but I think just the impression and the size, the spaciousness of the inside area here really is remarkable, and you're not going to find anything like it anywhere else. Just the effect of the many sort of consecutive domes building up towards the main focal point, uh, that sort of leaves just the eye to wander and sort of take in the whole space. And while maybe some modern buildings today are larger just in terms of height, the actual open space you have in one area, typically, I'm not sure of any that actually have a dome larger than Hagia Sophia. So the effect of that overwhelming sense of awe and size and scale, that still remains and I think impresses the modern viewer. And so here we can kind of see a better view up into the dome, and also sort of the seraphim mosaics. Again, you can kind of see those around the corners of the church. And then, of course, the column heads here. The church built by Justinian, you're going to see the monograms actually from him. So they're going to be monograms of his title, his name, Theodora's title, and her name. These are seen on most of the ornate column heads all around, in many different churches actually in the capital. So now we're coming up onto our first mosaic. This is of the Byzantine Emperor Alexander. And the angle is a little bit awkward here, just from down below looking all the way up. But you can see the emperor in multiple monograms circling him. He's wearing the traditional loros around his arm. Let me see here. I bet I can quickly pull up a better photo here, just so we can get a better idea of what's being depicted here. Well, that's not great. But anyway, you can just kind of see he's holding the akakia, the globus cruciger, but it's very exciting that when you first walk in, this is the mosaic you first see. And he's a minor emperor, but still just the impression of how long this has survived. And yeah, it's just very awe-inspiring. And then here you can kind of look down onto the Islamic prayer area now, and they've carpeted off the floors to allow for that. As said, now it is a mosque and not a museum, so you also have to watch out for the prayer hours 5 times a day. And so if you're in one of those prayer hours, you're actually not allowed inside the mosque because it's reserved for the people praying. And so this is the Empress's Lodge. This is where the Empress would have actually stayed during the ceremony. Both the Empress and the Emperor were on the second floor in these galleries, and then presumably they would have headed down to the main area for communion and different parts during the liturgy. But sort of the mainstay, the main area for them would have been up here. And of course, from the second floor, you do have a very impressionable view. Not only can you see everyone, very importantly, everyone can see you. So this would have been very important also for the emperor, just to make sure that he is seen. Uh, and while the empress is kind of here on the side, the emperor would have been on the more focal area that would have drawn more eyes to it. So it was certainly a deliberate choice that they would have remained up here during the liturgy for certain parts, and then likely heading back down to the main floor for communion. And so that was the Empress's Lodge, her quarters, and here we actually see this is where the Emperor would go, and we actually have the marble doors still remaining that would sort of corridor this off and separate the Emperor from everyone else, which is very nice to see. And they actually still have many details left, and very, very awe-inspiring to walk through those doors and to understand that how many famous people, Justinian the First, but how many well-known emperors, Basil the Second, Michael the Eighth, retaking the church, how many individuals have walked through those steps, likely every Sunday. So just a very cool experience to sort of travel through this area that we know so many important Byzantine figures themselves have actually done. And so here's a different angle on that. The marble doors, and of course, like I mentioned, with it being a mosque, all the female visitors had to wear a hijab, just in case you were curious that everyone's wearing one, that's why. It was actually like that for pretty much every mosque that you went to. And of course, in Byzantine Constantinople, most of the churches are mosques now. So I think if you are a female visiting, it's a good idea to make sure you bring a headscarf or buy one before you go, or elsewise you're not going to be admitted into the church and into the mosque. Uh, so here again, we see mosaics of seraphim going up into the dome. And again, those columns with the monograms of the emperor and empress. But of course, there are much more exciting monograms coming, much more exciting mosaics coming up. Um, Here we can see kind of across the view of the gallery, we have certain saints that their mosaics have survived, uncovered, which is nice to see. Let me just make sure we're still recording. Perfect. Yes. Okay. But we can see that many of the emperors, many of the mosaics still survive of different saints. We can see across the gallery. And of course, as you make your way through the emperor's area of the church, you walk upon the most famous mosaics that are very well known in Byzantine history. This being one, of course, that we're going to get better photos of here in a little bit. But right across from this main sort of mosaic of Christ, of Mary, and of John the Forerunner, John the Baptist, right across from that, we actually have the grave spot of Henrico Standolo. So that's the Venetian Doge in the Fourth Crusade who actually sacked Constantinople. He was buried in the church. And though I think this tombstone is anachronistic, I believe the spot where he's buried at is more or less confirmed to be the same, but the headstone is a more recent addition. But it's still very cool to see that in Byzantine history, such an infamous figure, you can still travel to their gravesite and see that in this church. And so now we're going to be getting better pictures of the famous mosaics. As mentioned, you've got Christ here, center, and then his mother, the Theotokos, and then St. John the Forerunner, St. John the Baptist, also there. And of course, these mosaics are intricately detailed with wonderful folding and arrangements, truly sort of the quintessential peak of Byzantine artistry, pushing the sort of medieval traditions of mosaic building and whatnot to its limits and what could be achieved. And just very cool to see all these in real life after, of course, who knows how many textbooks, different books, websites, articles always have this on the cover or somewhere else in the book. I mean, any piece on Byzantine art is incomplete without the Hagia Sophia. So just to see this then in real life was very breathtaking and very, very interesting, very fun. And speaking of the stray cats, one even made its way into Hagia Sophia. So you're going to see those all around. And so here we're starting to see the actual imperial mosaics in the emperor's box up here in Hagia Sophia. And this is John II Komnenos and his wife Irene. And we'll show their son is actually on the side panel. I've got pictures of that I'll show here in a little bit. But their son Alexius there, and then the Theotokos with the Christ child there in the center. And really beautiful, beautiful mosaics. Again, you've got the emperor and the empress in the Loros costume, the simplified Loros, I should add. I have to check on Alexander. I didn't look close enough earlier, but I believe he was wearing a traditional one. But I'd have to go back and check. But here we see the tradition or the simplified Loros. Yeah, so very interesting, beautiful depictions. There I am, smiling, got a few pictures taken. Figured, as I say, when in Rome, so when in Istanbul, might as well get my picture taken by these mosaics, just because they are so beautiful and so important. And of course, you wouldn't want to hide that handsome face, of course. No, but here we see more imperial mosaics. You've got Constantine Monomachos and his wife Zoe in between Christ seated upon the throne. Again, very well-known mosaics. Yeah, of high artistry and just very, very cool to see, very interesting. So here we can kind of see what I mentioned earlier. The emperor and empress, their son, is here on the corner, which is kind of hidden from first view, but once you get closer, you see that. And then, of course, the famous mosaic of the Theotokos, the Virgin Mary with Christ. Here, now that it's a mosque, it has been somewhat blocked off. So if you're down on the floor, the Muslim area, you can't see this, but from the upper gallery, you actually can. A shame, though, that they're covering up such great artistry and that with this no longer being a church or a museum, it's not very difficult to actually access some of this. But I suppose better to be thankful for what you can see than, I mean, they could have just destroyed it all, which they have done with different churches. There's a very famous case for, let me see here, on the Byzantine legacy, actually, they've got a list of all the Byzantine churches here, and the Pamakaristos monastery, also very well known for its mosaics, as we can see here. They've got some beautiful, or they had some beautiful mosaics of Christ, some of the best in the world, very well renowned, and considered this, along with Hagia Sophia and Kora, as being the most beautiful churches in the world. But Erdogan now, in his policy to convert Byzantine churches and museums into mosques, he's actually destroyed all the mosaics you see here. They no longer exist. they've been painted over. So another example of a well-known Byzantine church being destroyed into what is now pretty much more or less a mediocre mosque without any decoration or art, a senseless trend. So it is somewhat sad to see that all these mosaics are now lost more or less forever. Um, so yeah, part of the reason of going to Istanbul now is with certain museums of old churches being turned into mosques. Who knows how long they're actually going to be around still? So yeah, this is actually a church I didn't end up attending just because now it's gone, um, and the mosaics are no longer there. But thankfully in Hagia Sophia they still are. So here we kind of see close-ups of some of the other mosaics that we looked at earlier, and then of course the heir Alexius right there. A little bit difficult to photograph in that angle, but here you can kind of get the idea of directly behind this photo would be the area where the mosaics we just saw of John II, his wife Irene, and their son Alexios. And then straight ahead is going to be the mosaics of Christ, John the Baptist, and Mary. Sort of here again is a video sort of showing where all that's going to be. And again, kind of giving an idea of the grandeur and the size of this church. But it's very beautiful. And of course, this is the famous runic Viking Varangian vandalism graffiti in the church, where a Viking guarding the emperor up in his box wrote Halfdan was here, or an equivalent in runic. So that was also very cool to see, just evidence of the emperor and the Varangians in action. And then also very fun, someone had also, with a monogram, graffitied that into this. So just some very interesting graffiti and sort of a fun human element to this whole church that we kind of see bored, likely pagan Varangians scratching their names in the church pew upstairs. And again, me by the mosaics. Um, yeah, just some beautiful artistry. I'm not just talking about the mosaics there, but here we can see some more. But yeah, very nice, a beautiful church. And again, here's the emperor, sort of the door that would separate him from everyone else. The reverse, the backside of that. This was on the way out. It was kind of interesting. It's some sort of, I'm not sure exactly what. It looks Byzantine though, or late antique with a wreath, some kind of stone item that was just out in one of the courtyards here. So I'm not quite sure what that was, but I figured I'd take a picture just in case and maybe figure it out later. And so this then is going to be the doors of on the ground floor. I mentioned the ground floor is closed off. That is true. We're going to see if I skip forward a little bit. They do have one of the mosaics down here, but the entrance is blocked off for non-Muslim visitors, so you actually can't enter there. But the doors are very famous also here. Let me scroll back over. Give me one sec while I find my notes on this. So this was actually, these doors were commissioned by the Emperor Theophilus and his family. And so we read some of the Greek inscriptions around the door. Once again, this is from the Byzantine Legacy website. I'd highly recommend going over there. Lots of great information. The inscription reads, of Theophilus and Michael the Victorious. Lord, help Theophilus, Emperor. Mother of God, help Theodora Augusta. Christ, help Michael, Emperor. Year from the creation of the world, 6,349. And of course, the Byzantines measured the date of time from not the birth of Christ, but the creation, the biblical creation. So that's why when they say the year 6,349, that would be our year 841 AD. Yes, some very iconic and well-known doors here. And of course, they go to a wonderfully well-preserved mosaic from about the 9th or 10th century of the Emperor Justinian presenting the Hagia Sophia, the church that we're looking at. He's the architect, and not the architect, but the builder of the church, alongside St. Constantine to the Theotokos, Mother of God, and then also Constantine. Yeah, so just very awesome to see, and very cool to be there in this area, in this space, and just to think that you can walk along the same areas that so many emperors and empresses, court officials, and who knows who else that have walked along these same paths. So very cool. And so yeah, that was our, I'd say we were probably about in Hagia Sophia, perhaps an hour, hour and a half, especially with the ground floor being closed. It doesn't take too long to see it all. I mean, you kind of want to soak in the atmosphere and see just the grand immensity and scale of the building. But after that, you've only got a handful of mosaics and the runic inscriptions. So that was kind of day one, how we started out. And next up was our trip to Hagia Arene. And so this is actually in the Topkapi Palace of the Ottomans in their sort of facility. But it's a very well-known church, and it has been preserved. At the time when the Ottomans took the city over, they actually converted this into an arsenal instead of a church, or sorry, excuse me, into an arsenal instead of a mosque. So it actually was left somewhat alone. Um, there's a very famous aspect of this church, and that is it was actually, although it was built in the Constantinian period, um, rebuilt by Justinian, it was actually renovated by the iconoclastic Emperor Constantine V. And so what we see here up in the church is actually just a very simple mosaic pattern of a cross, no icons, no saints, no other detail, and a green border. And this is actually, as far as I'm aware, perhaps the only survival in Byzantine art of the iconoclastic period of a church that was decorated during this time. So obviously during the iconoclastic period, they wouldn't have been featuring, like we saw in Hagia Sophia, a rich variety of saints, holy men and women, and biblical figures, but instead it would have just been simple patterns of the cross and other Christian symbolism. Um, so yeah, this is actually very interesting in that we have one of the very few iconoclastic survivals, and of course, likely during the Ottoman period, because it wasn't a flashy, ornate mosaic of Christ or Mary or anyone else, it might have been more likely to survive because of that. So it was very cool to see that. And of course, this was kind of funny. During the Turkish hyperinflation, you can see the 500 lira ticket is now 600 with a sticker on top, thanks to what's going on there with the economics. But of course, it does make the trip more cost efficient with hyperinflation, but hurts the people in Turkey. And so here we see in the courtyard of Hagia Arene, you actually have imperial sarcophagi. You've got two of them. And these belong to a set of anonymous 4th or 5th century sarcophagi from the city. And so we don't know exactly who was buried in them, but just because of the porphyry, the red marble that we see here, we know it was imperial in association. So we can be sure that someone from the imperial family was buried here. We just can't quite say who was buried in what. And so leaving the Topkapi Palace complex, here we're walking up to the Istanbul Archaeological Museum. Just so we kind of verify this on the map. So we were in Hagia Sophia looking at that, walked over to Hagia Arene with the iconoclastic mosaic decorations, and now we're walking over to the Istanbul Archaeological Museum. And of course, what we looked at earlier was up here at the Hippodrome, and the Milion is also right here. So you can kind of see that for a lot of these sites, they're very close to each other. It's about a 10-minute walk to see all of the sites down here in this part of the old city of Istanbul. Yeah, so here we see various different ruins just sort of um, distributed about. And here's also a Byzantine Greek inscription that's outside in front of the church there, or I'm sorry, in front of the museum there. And then also, like we looked at in Hagia Arene, the imperial sarcophagi, you've actually got more and better examples here in front of the Istanbul Archaeological Museum. So here you can kind of see the different sarcophagi and how they sort of look, just in terms of immensity and size. And then kind of going by the front steps here, we can see that they are again covered in wreaths and other symbols that are common in late antiquity. Some of them have fared better than others. Some are pretty much completely intact, and others are obviously broken down. But very cool to see all this. And so this is now in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum that we're in. And they had a bust of Erdogan, or not Erdogan, excuse me, of Ataturk. So I thought I'd pose next to that. Much more of a fan when all of this is secular and open to the public, as opposed to the destruction of priceless Byzantine art in the name of a religion. So it is kind of sad to see that, but also, yeah, lucky to be able to see some of it. And so this is in the museum. This is a very famous statue of Alexander the Great. It's actually the only full body sculpture to survive from antiquity from him, as opposed to just his bust, but actually to have the entire torso. So that was pretty cool to see. Then here was a riding of Caligula, the emperor, to a Greek city. Also fun to see, very well preserved. Different Greek statues, and then also some Roman busts of the emperor. Uh, Here we see a very large Hadrian trampling upon a vanquished enemy. Yeah, and different figures here, different emperors. Some late antique sculpture. Kind of a bummer, but the Byzantine part was closed for renovation. Also, here we see a cheeked up statue out here. That was funny. But sadly, the Byzantine part of the museum was actually closed for renovations. So I didn't get to see some of that. But of course, some of these sites are very interesting. And I think the issue with a place like Istanbul, with so many historical sites in such a small area, no matter when you go, there's always going to be one or two that are closed to renovation. So you just got to hopefully you can get lucky. And I think for me, this definitely was a good time with Hagia Sophia being open. And of course, Kora Church, now a mosque. It was closed down for a couple of years for renovations and reopened as a mosque under Erdogan. But the fact that that was open was also a large impetus to go, just because we'll look at that later. But it's a very beautiful church. It would be a shame not to go see that. But here we see some of the numismatic aspects of the museum here from certain excavations in Ephesus. And so I mentioned earlier the sculpture of the serpents, the snake column, and the hippodrome. And so actually one of the heads has survived. There initially were three, as we can see in this depiction here, intertwined that would have actually been turned into a fountain with water spewing out of their mouths. And legend has it that at the time of the sack in 1453, the conquest of the city by the Ottomans, this was actually still intact. But Sultan Mehmed II, the man who orchestrated that, to test his strength, he actually took a mace to this serpent column and smashed the head off to see if he was strong enough to succeed in that task. So that's kind of the legend around why one of the heads was broken off. As for the other two, we're not quite sure. But there are many sort of dubious stories of unsure origins about the sultans testing their strength on some of these statues in the Hippodrome and trying to break them as a feat of conquest, I suppose. But it is cool to see just to get an idea of the style of the statue, to get the snake head right there. We can see, of course, a museum like this is going to have plenty of Greek amphora, different artifacts and notes, some Byzantine plates, silverware that was also very nice to see, communion, different items, a chalice for that, a spoon. Kind of also interesting here, they had a monogram stamped upon this plate, this bowl made out of a shell. I hadn't quite seen that before for Byzantine history, so I thought that was very interesting. That typically when I have seen a monogram, let me go back here. But when I have seen a monogram like that, most typically it is usually gold or silver, and the monogram serves to verify the purity of the metal. So to kind of see that bowl, that was also very interesting in that I'm unsure what function the seal would have served. Perhaps it's a maker's mark as well, but the museum didn't have much of an explanation on that. You had some ivories, of course, different gold work, silver and stone icons, also very interesting to see. Different rings also, of course, sort of common in the Byzantine tradition, and then also some interesting sort of quasi-pagan bowls that also look nice. And so this was the numismatic room, of course, of interest to our listeners, I'm sure. But there wasn't that much going on. You had pretty much this, and the other side of the room looked exactly the same. So you just kind of had four of these walls that showed off the coins. I'll just kind of scroll through these. If you want to pause the video, you can. They had different setups here for Byzantine coins, Greek and Roman. This was kind of fun. They had a misattribution, which kind of goes to show the level of care they're putting into this. But this coin is very clearly not from Theodore the First Ducas of Thessaloniki, but it's actually John III Vatatzes. So kind of an embarrassing mistake by the museum there. It was a fun typo there. As opposed to the Emperor's Vow, they had the Emperor's Wow. And then this, of course, is the famous Alexander sarcophagus. That's also very well known, um, sort of with scenes of Alexander fighting the Persians here that you see in a lot of Greek history textbooks. So that was pretty cool to see. And then also how some of the paint on the sarcophagus has also survived. And here's a courtyard. You still have some ruins, different stone pieces just kind of put outside. I guess they didn't have enough room in the museum. Not quite sure why they're there. The elements, but it is what it is. The museum was kind of interesting. I thought that if you compare it to, say, like the British Museum or the Ashmolean or even the KHM in Austria, I think it was certainly not quite at the same standard. There weren't really many artifacts that would kind of wow you. So I don't know. I thought that was somewhat interesting. I kind of would have thought there would have been more at that museum. So yeah, I don't know, but we didn't take too long to go through there. I think maybe within about an hour we'd seen the whole thing. Where I think the British Museum, when I first went there, I spent about 3.5 full days there and didn't even get to see half, but the Istanbul one was about an hour to see everything. So here's more of the city. Now we're getting into some of the good stuff. Obviously, Hagia Sophia is very fun, but this is the Kora Church. And of course, this is one of the better preserved, or probably the best preserved Byzantine church to survive from antiquity. And this was built earlier in the Constantine period. And the reason it has the name Kora is because in Greek that translates to outside of the walls. And this was outside of the Constantinian walls. So we can see here in 330 there was the original set of walls built, and then later on the walls of Theodosius. So the Kora church, actually, we can see on this map here is within the um, Theodosian walls, but because it was first built outside of the walls of Constantine, um, it still became known as a church outside of the city walls, even though it was inside of them. And you can see here, so that was kind of our first large hike of the day. The Istanbul Archaeological Museum is down here. We walked all the way up then to Kora Church. I think this was about an hour and a 15-minute walk, but it was a good way to explore parts of the city, to kind of go from all the way down here to sort of the upper extent of the walls. But of course, Kora was built in that period, but most famously it was restored by Theodore Medocetes, and he was a courier and sort of an equivalent of a prime minister to the Emperor Andronicus II. And Theodore Medocetes took about 2 decades and poured his life savings into this church, into decorating it with the best mosaics that he could afford. And very fortunately for us, not only has this survived, but also during this period, the Byzantine artistry tradition of iconography, it saw a large expansion and development towards sort of higher artistic standards during this period. Many scholars sort of regard the Paleologan Renaissance and the Paleologan mosaics as the ultimate expression of Byzantine art. And so here we kind of have the top man, besides the emperor in the Byzantine state, using all his money and resources to hire the best artists during the period with the most artistic flourishment in the empire, and that has survived. That's why some of the mosaics we're going to see here are so ornate, so thankfully well preserved. And besides mosaics, you also have fresco painting. And what we see here is a burial of from as far as I can tell, an unknown Paleologan. We can tell that because of the robes worn here. They have the monogram of the family. So it's clear that it's some sort of high-ranking Paleologan buried at this spot. But exactly who, we're not sure, as far as I can tell in my research. But you can see here various wonderful mosaics. This part of the church was a little bit more damaged, but as we go through, we're going to see some of the better mosaics coming up. And of course, here we have also another very iconic depiction of Christ, a very well-known piece of art that has survived, very impressive in person too. And of course, I'm not going to go through and explain every sort of scene that's going on here. I think with the Kora Church, you could probably, without exaggeration, make, I don't know, a 6 or 8 hour video just walking through all the different scenes. And if you really wanted to get in the nitty-gritty details and sort of explain the artistic technique, you could probably make a 24-hour long video, if not more, just sort of explaining the intricate details and artistry techniques used here. But I'm just going to go through the photos so you can kind of get an impression of what it's like to be at this church. But it really is something special, something spectacular. And so here we see, if I go back a little bit in the video, I'll let that play out. You can see another tomb here from another high-level Byzantine official, and sort of the very famous um, Anastasis scene that we're going to go into later. I've got close-up pictures of, but this is also a very well-known part of the church. So this is kind of one of the most famous pieces of Byzantine art in existence. This is the Anastasis, or the Resurrection, and it shows Christ rescuing Adam and Eve from hell, and kind of the idea that before Christ has resurrected, that everyone is sort of consigned to a slumber, if not eternal hellfire at that point. Certainly not resurrection until Christ has come. So sort of him coming back then allows the distinction of souls being placed in either heaven or hell. But it's a very important scene in the Byzantine tradition, in the Orthodox tradition, a very sort of iconic um, icon. And so what we see here is sort of the ultimate presentation of that, and perhaps the most well-known depiction of the scene. Just very well done. We can kind of see here they have some saints, some of the Cappadocian church fathers, among others, sort of below that very famous scene of Christ harrowing hell and saving Adam and Eve. And then, of course, St. Michael up above. And a beautiful painting here of the Theotokos, Mother of God, alongside the infant Christ. And here we see, I didn't have time yet to verify it. As I said, I kind of flew in last night and I'm preparing for a trip tomorrow. So I didn't have time to sort of check every mosaic for the video, but I think this should be St. Simeon the Stylite, based on the figure up here in such a conical tower, where he was a saint who lived on top of a tower for a couple of decades and gained a lot of notoriety and fame for that during the 5th century. So that was pretty cool to see, fun to spot. And so now we're leaving the fresco area. We already saw some mosaics earlier, but this is going to be more of that. This is kind of, yeah, as we can see, sort of a more ornate and more well-preserved part of the church. This is also very famous. This is a dome that's going to show the sort of genealogy of Christ, and then also many of the figures that sort of came before him. So yeah, very nice to see. A very well-known piece of art again. And then below that we have what might be the finest mosaic to survive, depicting Christ and Mary, and then different donors to the church, where we see here that was a sort of a common trend also in the late Byzantine period, of when a donor would help pay for the restoration of mosaics or build a church, they would often feature themselves in miniature alongside Christ or the Theotokos. And of course, this is perhaps the most famous mosaic scene of all. This is the actual donor of the church who restored most of what you see here today, who I mentioned earlier already. That's Theodore Medochites. We see him actually presenting the church we're inside to Christ. So that's a very famous scene, kind of taken from a bit further back. But as we can see here, he's holding the model church and giving that to Christ, sort of acknowledging his dedication and then also his sort of supplication to Christ and the generosity of his gift as well. And there I am, posted up. I just figured it's also a prime spot for a photo. But here we can see what is perhaps the most iconic and well-preserved part of the church, with the most amount of mosaics. I said there you have the genealogy of Christ and many different mosaics and scenes. And so, as I mentioned earlier, also, this was converted into a mosque. So, what you see here now is the prayer area. You still have some mosaics inside, but during service time, those would then be covered off with a cloth. So, you kind of see here you have Christ on the left side here, and then as you go over, you have the Virgin Mary with Christ child on the right. Let's put some of those closer up. And then walking out, you actually have the scene of the death of the Virgin Mary. And then what also caught my eye, one of the columns here, you see an angel, perhaps St. Michael the Archangel, but he's wearing the traditional Byzantine loros. And then again, close up on those donors I mentioned earlier. And so leaving that, we were at the Kora Church, or now the Kyrie Mosque. We walked to the Palace of Bakernai. So this is also a very well-known palace um, that was built during an earlier period, but mainly saw function during the Paleologan era. And so from that, we actually know of that in a number of scenes. And this was kind of to show that although the majority of Istanbul, we didn't really have any issues at all. This sort of part of town was in a little bit of a rougher area. So I probably maybe wouldn't go there at night, or I mean, it didn't seem too unsafe, but certain parts of it certainly were a little bit sketchy. But here we see the palace of the Porphyrionitas, or the Bakernai Palace. Although kind of sadly, there was an invasive reconstruction of that main part that quote unquote rebuilt the palace as it originally was. But they did a very poor job of that. But you can still see some of the untouched walls, or rather less touched, around. And you got a nice view of the city from sort of the top area of the reconstructed portion of the palace. And some more of the city walls there, and also a monogram in stone. And the house of the Porphyrionitas that saw during the civil wars between Andronicus II and III. They actually had some discussions in this area to reconcile. And then also we know from later historical events that during the civil wars of John V and John VI Canticozenos, that John VI Canticozenos actually besieged the mother of John V here in this palace during an earlier period in the Civil War, and got her to more or less surrender to his terms. But then later in the Civil Wars, the reverse actually happened, to where John VI ended up being besieged by John V, and he was forced to relinquish his throne and power. So a lot of late Byzantine history is actually tied up in that site. And here we kind of see some restored fortifications around, as well as some Ottoman towers sort of built in the area of the Theodosian walls. Usually you kind of see a combination of the sort of original lower area, and then sometimes a reconstructed top built at some sort of period for defense. Just to give you kind of a vibe of what this area looked like. The walls are more or less just sort of left alone and run through various portions of the city. And some kind of inscription. So here we see so what we kind of did there on our walk was, as I mentioned, we saw all the sites mentioned so far, and then to kind of get an idea of the city, we actually walked along the Theodosian walls all along here, and then ended up sort of coming back out around a different area to the west now, to the south, just to kind of get a feel for the city. And so what we see here now, actually, this is the Marmara Sea Walls around sort of a famous port area. This is one of the more well-preserved sections of that. And you can kind of get the best idea of the scale, sort of from this position, which was across some railroad tracks and a road. But you can kind of gauge just the feel of what has survived uh, and the height and scale of it. And so next up, after seeing that, we walked up to the Imrahor Mosque, uh, or otherwise known as the Studious Monastery. And of course, the studious monks were some of the most notorious in the whole history of Byzantium, causing many issues for the emperors, lots of headaches. They were strict enforcers of orthodoxy, and they're very well known for the whole iconoclastic controversy that the studious monks and monastery, it was a bastion of iconophile sentiments, and they were very vocal in their support for icons and triumphed alongside iconography during the restoration of orthodoxy under the Emperor Irene. And so we kind of looked at earlier, actually, the Hagia Irene, and we saw the iconoclast mosaic of the Emperor Constantine V. He was actually the same emperor who exiled the monks from their monastery, but after his death, they returned. But they're very well known throughout the history of the empire. I'm not going to go on too long of a rant about what they've done, but I think any Byzantine fan will very much appreciate that you can go to this site. It's one of the more rough condition-wise areas of the Byzantine churches because it was originally the studious monastery, then it was converted into a mosque, and then I think it was damaged during some fires and also some earthquakes. So what you see is sort of the original shell of the building without a roof or really any decoration or interior, but still it's very cool to be in the same spot and same area as a studious monastery. And from the studious monastery, we walked over to the Golden Gate um, in that sort of section of the Theodosian wall. Let me see here. I'm not sure where my photographs are. Maybe they didn't upload, but the Golden Gate is in this area. So when you're sort of checking out the Studious Monastery, what you're going to find is that the Golden Gate is also going to be right up there in the area, which is well worth seeing. The Golden Gate, that's actually the sort of ceremonial and triumphal entry spot for emperors during this period, and that it was well known for emperors during a triumph. They would enter through this gate and then sort of march down the Messier. So we can kind of see here on this map the Golden Gate, sort of following along this road. That would have been the triumphal procession for the emperors. So that was our pretty much first day in the city, just everything we saw there. I mean, there's a number of different ways you can kind of tackle the city. We sort of went more by theme as opposed to the exact geographical distance. But you can sort of, if you wanted to, sort of tackle it neighborhood by neighborhood. But for us, it was also very fun just to kind of walk around the city and sort of get to see everything. Um, so this was on day 2, starting out. We encountered a random Byzantine ruin, and I wasn't able to cross-reference this or figure out what exactly it was. But I did find it was on Google Maps. If I zoom in here, where this was, it should be right here, I believe. Exactly, yeah. So it's got 3 reviews. It's just named or labeled the Byzantine ruins. And I couldn't find a reference for this anywhere on the Byzantine Legacy website or elsewhere. So I'm honestly not quite sure what it is, but it was just an interesting find spot. And when you're in the city, you're going to find a lot of Byzantine ruins. And here's the famous Grand Bazaar, one of the streets. And so now um, we've sort of seen those ruins, and we're going up to this portion of the city around here above the Hippodrome and Hagia Sophia. And what we're seeing now are various palaces. And so where we're going to step first is St. Euphemia's, and that's also a very well-known church. Um, Sadly, it's kind of more or less been destroyed now. All you have are the ruins, but they were able to identify the complex. But sort of interesting to see. And then also, oops, I'm going a little bit too far. And also in the same area, you do have the palace of Antiochus, who was a Persian eunuch in the 5th century. And then you also have another palace here from Lausos. So kind of when you're in this area, you sort of have these two palaces and a later church who sort of incorporated parts of those ruins into one area. And so from this area, we decided to go to check out the Befa Mosque. That was next. Um, or sorry, I'm mistaken. First, we went to look at the Little Hagia Sophia. So that is going to be right here. Little Hagia Sophia, that's the church of St. Sergius and Bacchus. And that was a very nice mosque, actually. Just in terms of the Byzantine history, it was richly preserved. Let me pull up my notes here. But if you can see here in the video, you've actually got a Greek legend running across in between the column decorations here. I'm not sure if you can make it out. The video might be a little bit, a tad bit too quick, but you can kind of see here if I zoom in. You've actually got a Greek legend running alongside the interior of the church. And this was built by Justinian. And here's the translation of what that says. So let me play the video here. But it says, the translation, other sovereigns have honored dead men whose labor was unprofitable, but our spectre Justinian, fostering piety, honors with a splendid abode the servants of Christ, the servant of Christ, begetter of all things Sergius, whom not the burning breath of fire, nor the sword, nor any other constraint of torments disturbed, but who endured to be slain for the sake of Christ the God, gaining by his blood heaven as his home. May he in all things guard the rule of the sleepless sovereign, and increase the power of the God-crowned Theodora, whose mind in adorning with piety, whose constant toil lies in unsparing efforts to nourish the destitute. So we have there a inscription from Justinian and Theodora inside the church that has survived. And this church was actually very important. Um, and we know that it saw a number of different events. Also, the very famous Three Chapters controversy under Justinian, when he was abusing Pope Vitellius and using force to try to make the pontiff agree with his theological positions. This was actually the church where Pope Vitellius sought refuge. We also know that there was an anti-Monophysite council held here, which is interesting. And this was sort of at one point, a space for Monophysite refugees, but after the death of Theodora, those Monophysites no longer resided here. And then we also know that, as mentioned, the earlier Studius monastery we looked at, that was up here. That was the center of the iconophiles. Well, we know that Little Hagia Sophia, the Church of Sergius and Bacchus, that was actually the center of the iconoclast movement. So you kind of have those two churches in opposition during this period. But again, there's so much history that could be talked about. Um, I've included the link to the Byzantine Legacy website that if you click on the Little Hagia Sophia description here, you can actually find the link to get more history about that. And I'll post that Google Maps description, or the link in the description. And so next we walk towards the Forum of Arcadius. No, it should be Theodosius, excuse me. So these are the remnants of the Forum of Theodosius. And what you see here is actually his arch, the surviving pillars there, and the stone then sort of cast around from what has collapsed. And so going to our map here, you can find that we already saw the Forum of Constantine right here. The Forum of Theodosius is going to be a little bit further ahead on the same road. And so that will be then on our map right about here. So this was pretty cool to see, just a lot of ruins, and then also to see the remnants of the column of Theodosius that would have once stood here. There's going to be a museum, an Islamic museum, and also a public bath. They've got a museum inside, and that actually houses reincorporated pieces of the column. So we can kind of see here at the bottom, in the foundation of the building, certain pieces used, and also here you can see a figure holding a spear or sword. So that was pretty cool. And then if you go inside in the museum, they actually have also more pieces there from the column reused. Here you can see more of those stray cats. They're all over the city. And then here is that the Bayezid Hamami, where the parts of the column were reused. This is in the back side of that. Okay, all right. And next up, we're going to the Church of the Theotokos Kyriotissa, and this is the current Kalerhande Mosque. And so this should be somewhere around here. Now, hold on. I forget exactly where in the city layout this was. Let me see if this was it. No, that was the column of Marcia. Here we go. So it's going to be around the center area here. Um, but this church was built around the 4th to 5th century, where it was an earlier secular Roman structure, sort of reincorporated into a church. And then the existing building dates back to the 12th century. And it's also very well known that during the Fourth Crusade, when this church was sacked, that certain Franciscans actually moved into the church, and then that some of the earliest mosaics we have of Saint Francis actually come from this church. So it's very interesting in that connection that it's tied into the Fourth Crusade, and that you have Franciscans there. So very cool to see, and then also frescoes and whatnot inside, and also some in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum. You can also see nearby, let me scroll past, the Aqueduct of Valens actually runs pretty much parallel to this church. So you can also see that in this area. Hold on, let me go find where I was here. Oops, that's Cora still. But that it was a very cool church to see, or mosque. It was closed when we attended, but still. Here we go, perfect. You can see more of those ruins, and then here the Aqueduct of Valens. So this was the Betha Mosque, and that is going to be around here, a little bit further north. Um, like I kind of touched on earlier, I think this was kind of the only one sort of sketchy area in the city. I think besides that, I didn't have any issues at all. Never really felt uncomfortable. But in this neighborhood, I would say that it's pretty rough, and I don't know, maybe not worth going to unless you really wanted to see the Paleologan mosaics there. But I was kind of surprised to see how rough it was, just because I think everywhere else in the city was actually quite nice. But this seemed to be just a bunch of refuse heaps and kind of a shanty town built up. So pretty sketchy. And had I known that, it may not have gone. But still, came out of there with no issues. Just a heads up for anyone who might want to see the area. But the Vetha Mosque, whose church it originally was, or it was originally a church, it actually has some Paleologan mosaics. And when we went, it was closed, but the windows were left open, so I kind of peered my phone inside just to get a view and take some pictures for you all. It was a little bit hard to photograph. You can kind of see the dome up here. And if you zoom in, you actually have some nice intact mosaics left from this period. So that was pretty cool to see. And then also, of course, the very decorated columns, likely recycled from earlier buildings, but very nice to see. And there was the open window. But here you can kind of see what I'm talking about with the neighborhood here. You've got abandoned buildings and people living inside there. And yeah, pretty sketch. And like I said, I certainly wouldn't go there at night, and I wouldn't go there alone. But it is what it is. Oops, I keep clicking out of here on accident. There we go. This was also kind of somewhat interesting and also sad. Another obviously Byzantine uh, site here, ruins, but you've actually got a door put up. If my picture will load, you've got a door installed, and someone actually living there at the moment. And as you can see, sort of trash just strewn all about. So that certainly wasn't the nicest area, but yeah. Anyway, once you leave that certain little neighborhood, you're fine. And walking north, we next went to the Mullah Zayrek Mosque, and that, of course, is the Christ Pantocrator Monastery. And that's a very famous monastery. This was built by the Comnenian emperors, and for their dynasty, it was sort of seen as an important way to sort of dominate the city skyline with their own building. And although the modern infrastructure has kind of hidden the church and now mosque away. Originally, this would have sat up on a hill and would have been visible from all over the city. You can kind of see the dome of the church in certain parts of it peering out behind buildings. But this was, as I mentioned, a very important church with many imperial burials. There's the Church of the Holy Apostles, which was destroyed by the Ottomans after taking the city, completely destroyed with no trace left. But after that, this is actually the imperial church with the most amount of burials um, of emperors and empresses known. So John II Komnenos and his wife Irene were buried here. And we actually saw their mosaics earlier at Hagia Sophia. So with their son as well. So we looked at those earlier, but they were actually buried here. And then also their heir, Manuel the First, and his wife Bertha were buried here. And then the Paleologan emperors Manuel II and John VIII were also buried here. So sort of just a very historically rich place with lots of imperial burials. And then during also the Fourth Crusade, this became the headquarters of the Venetians. And as I mentioned, this sort of was designed and built by the Comnenians to sort of dominate the imperial skyline. And as you can see, you pretty much have unobstructed views from all over the city from this area. The modern infrastructure does kind of block that off, but it's still quite impressive. Here we can see some kind of porphyry plinth column established up here. That's in pretty poor shape, but obviously at some point might have been an imperial inscription or statue attached. So here we can see the inside of the church and the mosque, and then, of course, with it being a mosque, everything's covered with the prayer carpets, but they kind of lifted some up to show the Byzantine floor underneath. But here you can kind of see the inside with the original Roman columns, still a few attached and remaining. And also sort of more exposed brickwork, and then of course more Byzantine columns. And then also we have the original marble doorways still in the building. So yeah, overall very nice. I mean, not much of the Byzantine history is left besides the building, but of course there's so much history here that it was still very cool to be at and get to see. And then next we kind of had, this was further away. I actually kind of stumbled across this on accident. It again wasn't on the Byzantine legacy website, but going to a different location, we walked by it. And this is the Sheikh Suleiman Mosque. But it actually turns out this was originally part of the same monastery complex, monastic complex, and was later made into a mosque. But as you can see, this original complex would have taken over a significant spot in the city and been quite large, containing at least these two areas and more that would have been destroyed since. But it's yeah, a very inspiring and interesting part of the city and its Byzantine heritage. And so now we're coming up on the column of Marcion. That is going to be right here. And so this was actually erected by the city prefect Tatianos. That still survives today. Kind of in the middle of a roundabout. You can see there's still an inscription and sculpture that survives. And then also Christograms on two of the sides. Okay, and next we're looking at the Monastery of Lips. And so this is also a very well-known church, now a mosque. Let me find this on the map real quick. I kind of forget, I think this was further south somewhere. Let me search here real quick. Okay, it was hidden under my nose. Hold on, I should have that saved on my list. Check real quick. But this is a very well-known mosque. Here we go. I believe this is it actually. Yes, okay, perfect. So it's the Finari Isa Mosque. but for the Byzantine enthusiasts, it's known as the Lips Monastery. And this was actually built by Constantine Lips, who was an aristocrat under the Emperor Leo VI. But later on, it was actually renovated by the widow of Michael VIII. So Michael VIII Palaiologos, of course, retakes Constantinople from the Latins, and after he dies, his wife built this as a mausoleum church for the Palaiologan dynasty. And so we see a lot of Palaiologans that we know were buried here, and that includes then, so the Empress Theodora, who was married to Michael, she was buried here. Her mother was buried here. Her daughter with Michael was buried here. Her son, the Emperor Andronicus II, was buried here, and her other son, Prince Constantine, was buried here. And then also Irene, the wife of Andronicus III, was buried here. And then Anna, the wife of John VIII, was buried here. So we do know that this was a very important dynastic monument for the Palaiologans with lots of history. But again, this is a mosque, so not too much of the interior still survives. Um, and also, sadly, when we went, it was the call to prayer at that time. Since we were in a somewhat tight schedule, we didn't stick around too long, but couldn't enter then. But still, very cool to see the spot and to know how much history is associated here, even if not much of the material culture per se has survived. And so next up, we are looking at the column of Arcadius. So this actually also marks his forum. And not too much of the column is left, obviously. We have the giant plinth here. You can kind of see at the very top, we have just a little bit of decorations that have survived at the top of that plinth. But we know it was modeled on the column of Trajan and Marcus Aurelius. It would have originally been very impressive. And if you go to our handy maps here, you can see that. So we've seen the form of Constantine, we've seen the form of Theodosius, and now we're all the way up here to the form of Arcadius. So kind of a walking along that main road, seeing all of those sites, but very cool to see. Now it's just a residential neighborhood, but at the time it would have been very important. And so now next we're looking at the Church of St. Palaiologos, and that is going to be right here in this park area. And of course, the Church of St. Palaiologos was a very wealthy and renowned church. And even though not very much survives today, all we have are the ruins. We actually know that it was one of the most richly decorated churches, and during the Fourth Crusade, it was sort of looted and destroyed and never rebuilt after. But a lot of the material culture that was stolen during that period actually survives in Venice and other cities. So we can find different parts of this church sort of scattered across Western Europe. But still, it does take up a very impressive footprint, the relics and remains. And this is just kind of the show. You see different column heads here. All throughout Istanbul, you're going to find Byzantine column heads, marbles, and different artifacts just strewn up across different parks. Sometimes with trash and litter on them. A little bit sad to see. Okay, and so now we're coming up on the church of the Panagia Muchliotissa. A bit of a mouthful there, but this is actually very interesting in that for the Byzantine churches in the city, almost all were converted into mosques, but this is one of the very few churches that actually survived as a church up till the modern times. So we actually do have inside that church icons dating back to about the Byzantine period, presumably that have stayed in that church the whole time. And so that, of course, is very interesting to see. But yeah, it seems to have been restored under Maria Paleogina and made into a convent. But again, very interesting to see that this church sort of has survived as a church throughout all that time. And you kind of see across one of the doorways, the Byzantine double-headed eagle is what it appears to be, and two crosses. And then sort of different little symbols in the brickwork there still surviving, crosses and whatnot. And this is kind of leaving that area. Going down, you can kind of see the Tower of Galatia. Again, this is sort of in that same district as the other one, the Vefa, to where it's not necessarily the best part of the city, But as soon as you kind of turn the staircase, after you go to a very colorful part of town, and some lively markets that are apparently associated with a very famous Romanian historian. And then kind of leaving that, we'd walked all the way up to the Virgin Mary Orthodox Church, and we sort of followed the seawalls all the way back down to head to the column of the Goths. So that was about an hour walk, and it was very fun to just to see the different elements of Byzantine history left. Lots of ruins still there. You can kind of see Galatia and the seashore, and then different Byzantine walls still, parts of the sea walls and different buildings. This I wasn't quite sure. It looks like it might be an early Ottoman bath, or perhaps a late Byzantine structure with a dome, but again, abandoned at this point, but lots of very interesting buildings like this throughout the city. And then kind of walking back down that area, you run into perhaps the nicer part of the city, sort of a shopping district and luxury hotels and restaurants and whatnot. But having walked all the way back, you walk down here to the column of the Goths. But in this area, you also have what is a famous orphanage. So what you see here behind this fence, that's actually the orphanage of St. Paul. And of course, the Byzantines were very renowned for building many orphanages and churches, and here we kind of see the remains of one of those. And then, of course, this is the column of the Goths, commemorating a victory over the Goths by either Constantine or Claudius Gothicus. That's unsure who. And then kind of leaving that, there's also an interesting church nearby, and that is the St. Therapon Church, which contains a holy spring or well. But by the time we got there, it was already closed, but also well renowned. And then after a long day of walking, got the beer and some football in the background, which was nice to see. And then this was sort of my taxi ride back out of the city. So if you look in the distance, actually, you can make out the Theodosian walls. I was very fortunate that the taxi ride I took, if I pause the video very quickly, our Airbnb was pretty much near the Great Palace Mosaics Museum, pretty much in this area. And the taxi ride went along the shore here and then kind of across the Theodosian walls. So I pretty much got to see, the full Theodosian walls in this taxi ride. So I thought I would take a quick video just to show everyone what the walls look like kind of in the distance of Turkey, and then also just a little bit of a flavor of the city itself. So I hope you all enjoyed this sort of walkthrough, not quite a vlog, but kind of explaining my trip to Istanbul and what I've seen there. A lot of the Byzantine history, the mosaics, the art, the culture, the churches. Certainly an unforgettable experience. And for anyone who's a Byzantine fan, I think a must do, a must see. And like I said, the Google Maps list of every location, which I've also added descriptions to explaining what they are, and links to resources for more history. I'm going to leave that in the description, so anyone who ever goes to Istanbul, they can not only watch this video to get a full run through of what to see, they can also just add my list to their Google Maps app, and then use that to find whatever they'd like. And if you have any suggestions of what I might have missed, or what to add to that list, please leave those in the comments. Yeah, thank you all for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this.